Susi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tara, and thanks everybody for joining the discussion today from my side too. So as Tara said, this poll was undertaken in order to understand how Europeans are thinking about the European project, what it can do on the challenges they face, and what role French leadership can play within that. And the polling took place at the end of January and the beginning of February, so just ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Just to run through, I think, some of the top line findings that are going to be pertinent to our discussion today. First of all, as has become familiar to those of you that may have seen ECFR polling that we've been doing since 2019, there is a strong sense across the EU that the national political system is not delivering. As you can see on the slide in front of you, a majority in the majority of member states, if you like, believe that their national political system is broken, and also are much more likely to think that than to believe that it's working, apart from within a small group of member states. But if we can go on to the next slide, what was surprising in our poll this time around was that sense that the system isn't working at national level is also strongly replicated when we asked about whether or not international cooperation was delivering on the issues that they were worried about. So we asked the question about whether or not they thought that the global system of cooperation worked in a range of different areas. And as you can see, on climate change and the coronavirus pandemic, we got big majorities. On climate change, a massive 71% who said that they thought that the system was broken or was somewhat broken. And what I would like to highlight with regards to this question is that we went into this thinking that it would be the sort of issue on which we would only have a minority holding a view at all. But as you can see here, the responses, particularly for climate change and coronavirus, that said that they didn't know, that they didn't have a view on this, are actually quite small compared to a lot of questions that we ask around the field of foreign policy. But if we could go on to the next slide, what we can see is that Europeans do seem to be placing their hope between the national system and international cooperation at the European level. Across all member states, apart from Germany and Denmark, you can see that people were more likely to think that their own country was broken than that the EU is broken. And this finding is underpinned by a series of other questions that we asked in the survey around whether or not it was a good thing for their country to be a member of the EU, where we got majority saying that they thought it was. Now, one of the key questions on which, when we asked whether this should be dealt with at national EU level, or if neither of those levels could deal with the problem, that came through with a very strong response arguing for European cooperation, was on the question of security, guaranteeing security at my country's borders. So if we could go on to the next slide, we'll be able to see that the largest answer in every member state that we covered argued that the appropriate level to deal with security at our borders was cooperation at EU level. And just as a reminder that this was a survey which took place ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and I would wager that this feeling of the need for European cooperation on the security question has only intensified. And if we can go on to the next slide, we'll be able to see that actually the Russian threat is very much reinforcing this sense of the need for European cooperation on security. So for those who perceive Russia as a major threat, when we asked about their threat assessment for the EU, they were more likely to see the idea of European sovereignty positively. And therefore we can infer from this that there's a sense that if you're worried about Russia, you're thinking about how European states can act together. And then just a final point, which I think is quite striking from the research and quite pertinent for our discussion today, if we could go on to the next slide, is that Europeans seem to be comfortable with the idea of French leadership in taking forward European sovereignty. What you have in front of you are the results from a question we asked about whether or not France was a partner that other EU member states can rely on. And as you'll see, although there are different levels of belief in this across the EU, for every member state, again, the answer that they agreed with the idea that France was a reliable partner was bigger than those who disagreed. And then just finally, to dig down further into this, we asked on what areas they were confident that France would protect European interests. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Quite interestingly, it was particularly on standing up for democracy and human rights, defence and security, and relations with the US that we got the strongest reported levels of trust in France to defend the EU interest, and also the biggest gaps with those who argued that they didn't trust France on this front. So these are all highly relevant questions for dealing with the current Russia crisis. And what I would just conclude by saying is that much has been said about the EU having taken giant leaps forward as a geopolitical actor in the last 2 weeks since Russia's invasion. Arguably, to be fully geopolitically sufficient, we need to be able to prevent crises as well as react to them. But it seems that from this data set that as leaders are heading now to the discussions in Versailles, it seems fairly clear that they do have the backing of the European public in taking this project forward and driving security cooperation further. So with that, back over to you, Tara, to lead the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Susi. I think I'll turn to David immediately because my question to him is his first reaction to the data. I'm guessing it makes him happy, but if he could go into, that is my guess. But if he could go a bit more into details into what maybe his expectations were of the results and how they might prove counterintuitive.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tara. Thank you all. Very happy to comment a little bit on this data, which I agree is comforting in a way, surprising in other ways. For instance, before I go to French-related issues, the fact that the people surveyed would find that there is currently more cooperation internationally on trade than on COVID or climate change, for me is a little bit of a surprise. And also, I must say, when it comes to the data on political systems being broken, there is some comfort in the overall rather high level of confidence in the EU, but the fact that almost everyone in every country, there is, including in France, there is a very poor perception of the domestic systems, I think is very interesting. And it's interesting that it's across all the countries you have surveyed, which have very different political systems and very difficult political circumstances. So I think that tells us something about not, in fact, so much any of those countries individually, but something that applies probably to all European democracies, or maybe even to all democracies. When it comes to France, of course, I'm very happy to see that the French think that France is a reliable partner. I didn't have too much doubts on that, but of course it's interesting that it's also the perception of at least that more people believe that in Europe than believe the opposite. On one of your latest slides, it was interesting to see that it applied more to human rights defense relationship with the US than it did with Russia and China. I take note of that. I'm just hoping that if you were to do this survey today, or maybe in a couple of weeks, the figure related to Russia would change, because certainly what we are trying to do in this phase, as in our role as presidency of the Council of the EU, is to build very strong EU consistency, unity, and firmness in the response to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I actually think that this is perceived by our European partners, but I hope it will show in the data in the weeks to come.
Thanks a lot. I wanted to ask you about the reliability of France as a partner, and maybe, do you think there's been an evolution there? It's hard to say from our own data, but I think, typically on the Russia file, there was quite a bit of change in the method, in the diplomatic method that was applied when the President Emmanuel Macron went to Russia the second time. And so really the idea of coordinating with allies, not only Europeans, but Americans as well, because we're also mindful that this show of unity is important. And I mean, do you sense that there is a heavier weight on France to represent this unity, not only because France is holding the presidency of the Council of the EU, but also because there's the, the presidential election coming up, and that a strong European diplomacy is also needed here?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I must be careful not to over-rationalize the data, because I think some of this really asks us questions, and we must thoroughly think about it. But I suppose that the French, let's say, brand, in a way, is very well identified when it comes, for instance, to issues like defense. So I'm not surprised that we would be perceived as a credible partner or leader in this regard. I think when it comes to the relationship with Russia, probably what has stuck most with our partners in the last few years is our insistence that we would have try to engage a meaningful dialogue with Russia. And I suppose that's where part of the skepticism comes from that we see in the numbers. I would note that today, many of those critics are, in my opinion, extremely happy that there is a line, a connection that allows to have some kind of contact with Vladimir Putin, because it would be an even more dangerous situation if he were not to talk to anybody. But I think that's where it comes from. I also think that we are showing these days that we are really, as France and as Presidency of the Council of the EU, working with the Commission, working with the President of the European Council, working with all our partners, we are doing everything we can to have a cohesive approach on this, and we are debriefing all our partners on a constant basis, and it will of course be one of the issues at Versailles. How do we stick together as the EU, and do we increase our independence, in particular on the energy front from Russia, and how do we get our act together in a way to be more resilient and more resistant to Russia when it threatens our security.
Thanks a lot. I don't know if we can put the slide on European sovereignty, the figures on the perceptions on European sovereignty may be up again, because I wanted to ask you before we move on to the summit today. Susi and I identified what we call the French paradox, which is that the idea of European sovereignty is really identified with being very French, and it seems that it is in France that it is less popular, understood, appreciated. I'm sorry, this is not the slide that I was thinking of on the perceptions of European sovereignty, but it's fine. The figures were very low for France, and so what do you think about that? Do you think, and the fact also that they're quite high in other countries, and namely Estonia has a 58% of approval rating on the idea of European sovereignty. What do you think you make of that?
I mean, first of all, it's surprising. I'm not going to hide it. Surprising. The French data is surprising. The Estonian data probably as well. I think maybe one of the things it reflects is that there is not a very clear understanding of what this notion of sovereignty is. And as much as we discuss it, at least in our kinds of circle, I'm still not sure we understand it ourselves. And we go from sovereignty to strategic autonomy, to open strategic autonomy, to independence, to more capability, to more power. And so maybe it's in part an issue of terminology. This said, I think if you take other if you take your polling as a whole, you would still see the French quite eager to do what I would put under the headline sovereignty, which is to become more assertive, more able to define our own choices, more able to protect ourselves. So maybe we ought to focus more on the concrete policy implications of this term, and maybe we should revisit our passion for terminological slogans or innovations.
And so concretely, precisely, we're heading into the Versailles summit. I mean, you are heading into the Versailles summit in a few minutes. What do you think can be expected for the European people? Because clearly there is a sense, and I encourage everyone to read our study. It's also available in French now. It's fully translated into French and available online. Where do you think we can go from there? Because there is support from the European citizens. Maybe they were actually quite prescient and ready before the decision makers to take a leap when it came to European defense. Where do you think this can take us? I mean, clearly it seems that the sky is the limit these days. We've managed to see almost a change of paradigm coming from Germany. Even the European Union is empowered right now, and I would say rightfully so. So can you give us a small idea of what we can expect from here? And I would encourage the audience again to send their questions through, and I'll turn to Susi and Catherine as well in a minute.
We will see how far the leaders get at Versailles, and we will continue the discussion from Versailles to the European Council at the end of this month, which will have a strong focus on European defense. And then we will continue certainly under our presidency, but I believe under the next presidencies, because, you know, we are working with the Czech Republic and Sweden as part of the same trio. We will continue, I think, to push the same agenda. That agenda, you know, I think Victor Hugo said, nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And admittedly, in a quite French view, that idea is the idea of Europe puissance, building Europe as a power. It was a totally exotic idea for most of our partners, if not all of them, until a few years back. And I think for many reasons, but I hope French leadership is one of those reasons, this idea, the time has come for this idea, I believe. What power means, I think, is first reduce our critical dependencies, starting with energy, and that will be a very big focus at Versailles. It means improving or closing, in the short run, closing our most pressing capability gaps in defense, but also build a medium, long-term, consistent policy in the security field. Those are quite new ideas for Europe. I think it's, and I will try not to be too long on this, but I think Europe as a political project was specifically designed against the notion of power, because it had not worked so well for us, power politics, in the 20th century. And so even the way the EU was designed is in a way meant to dissolve power and to turn it into processes that kind of put aside the politics and the emotion. And we have done great things with this methodology. But the idea that the EU should exert power was a bit lost in the process. And I think that's the reason why we have thought for so long collectively that the best way to interact with the outside world would be to contaminate them through, trade and democracy and values and the power of our example, and that little by little our southern eastern neighborhood up until China would become like us. Nobody believes this anymore. We see that we have to deal with a challenge, a threat actually from Russia for presumably quite some time. We have the challenge of the rise of China. We still remember vividly the Trump years. And so the consequence of all this is that we need to step up and build an ability to deal with the world as it is. And I think that idea is now appropriated by all of our partners. So now the discussion will be how do we commit the right resources, how do we define the right policies to speed up. Basically, I think we are on the right track, but we need to speed up considerably because we are dealing with other powers, players, rivals who are going very fast.
Thanks a lot. I noticed that you didn't reveal any scoop, so I am a bit disappointed. Let me turn to Catherine now. We see that French, Poles and Italians don't trust the French actually to play a leadership role on defense and security. What would you make of that? And particularly in a context where European strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty is really being pushed as a priority for the summit today. I'm sorry, Catherine, you are muted.
2 years and this still happens. I'm sorry. Yes, those polling results that you revealed around Italy actually came as a little bit of a surprise to me. But perhaps, you know, I had over-interpreted the relationship between Draghi and Macron and, you know, underestimated what actually is still the Italian public sentiment. I think it's probably the result of a couple of things. One is that I think that Italy is feeling particularly vulnerable because, you know, even prior to the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the energy crisis was hitting Italy and now threatens to hit Italy even more strongly. And it is the other nation alongside Germany that is most dependent on Russian energy and on Russian gas. So I think that there's an element of trepidation whereby I'm not sure that the Italian public, trusts anyone to really be able to help them, in part because they are so absolutely convinced that their system is broken. So that, you know, even outside help often is interpreted as being squandered, by the time it reaches Italy. And even the money that's already been dispersed to Italy from the recovery package, the pandemic recovery package, is seen as being squandered. So I think that there's a little bit of despair there. And I think also there has been, a difficult relationship with France over the past few years. There have been different moments of clashes, around the issues around the shipbuilding yards in Italy. There have been, other clashes, admittedly under previous governments, before Draghi, that have in some ways put in jeopardy a little bit the way that the Italians feel about the French. And then finally, I think, it is something to be said, which is that it has always been a little bit like with the UK, a bit of a love-hate relationship, between Italy and France. So it's a little bit volatile.
Thanks a lot. Susi, I want to turn to you because there was a question on your presentation as well. And so this question is, do you believe the respondents grasp the idea of European interests? Because there is, so the question is, after all, in most of the EU member states, there is no regular teaching about the EU in school curricula. So should we ask also for such a teaching to appear in the schools inside the member states? I think probably we can agree to that, but there's not much we can do. But maybe on the understanding of the European interest question, I would love to have your feedback.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question, and it also relates to a point which David raised regarding the fact that Europeans seem more confident in France's ability to defend the European interest when it comes to different policy files. than on Russia and China. And actually, just as background, when we asked a similar question ahead of the German elections regarding Germany and their willingness to defend the European interest, we had a similar result, but trust on different files. So with Germany, they were more likely to answer that Germany would defend the European interest on economic issues. Security was much further down. But this pattern that Russia and China were very low was there in the case of Germany as well. And so I think that there are a number of things at work here. I think that there is probably a sort of a broadening realization of what security means actually in these relationships now. And I believe it will be quite interesting to sort of dig down into this in terms of future polling, looking at the fact that we have put together this package of economic sanctions, that we're now talking about diversifying our energy supplies away from Russia and so on. I think that the public are sort of becoming aware of what policymakers have been grappling with over recent months, which is that security now is not just about defence cooperation in a very slim sense, and it actually is about these thematic issues. But I think as to whether or not that there is a kind of an understanding about what Europe stands for, one of the things that comes through to me quite clearly from this data set is that for respondents, being European isn't a sort of a geographical association. It has a strong attachment to the values of the project. We asked a set of questions around what levers should be used to defend against backsliding on rule of law and democracy within the EU, and we got majorities in favour of all the proposals we put forward, from taking away the veto in council to withholding of European funds on the basis of this, to public criticism, which obviously got the highest support. And this kind of echoes previous surveys that we've done when we've asked about what European power should be, so this was a survey that took place last April, and the response at that point was that as an actor, Europe's key role should be about defending democracy and human rights on the global stage. So I think there's, on the one hand, this kind of reaffirmation of the principles of the European project, but also a sort of a growing awareness of what defending those principles is going to mean in an environment where they are very much contested.
And precisely, maybe to continue on that, David, there's a question addressed to you in the chat, which is that at the beginning of the 90s, it seemed soft power was the one to prevail and endure. And where do you think it got lost? So pretty big question.
I remember those times vividly because I was preparing to be a diplomat at the time, and all my teachers at Sciences Po and elsewhere at the time explained that it was really a silly idea because we were moving past power politics, past interstate relations, and anybody opening an internet website or an NGO would have more power than a diplomat. I never believed it, and I'm quite happy to be where I am in those days. But more seriously on this issue, something our minister often says is that the distinction between soft and hard power is becoming increasingly irrelevant. Let me give you a few examples. I'm quite convinced that what Putin is doing in Ukraine is not only because of the hard power alleged fears that he has from NATO, but from the soft power influence of the EU on the Ukrainian public, and potentially through Ukraine to his own domestic population. And so in a way, he responds with hard power to a soft power threat. I think it's also interesting to see that in the response to this aggression, in fact, Europe is very central because the most important policy response at this point is the power of our sanctions, which of course are more powerful coming from the EU than from other players who have less relationship in the economic or investment fields with Russia. So sanctions, they're kind of in between soft and hard power. I also think, as much if we look forward at how we are going to emerge from this crisis as a political project, yes, we must become very much more of a hard power animal, the EU as such, and we have a long way to go because we were not designed for this collectively. But we must absolutely keep what makes this institution so special and so different from an international organization. And that's the ability to domesticate violence through this permanent negotiation that we have between ourselves, and this realization that there is a European interest, to get back to the previous question, or maybe that more accurately, that national and European interests are totally intertwined. I should tell you, in 18 months in this office, I've almost never come across a decision where I have on the one hand the national interest and on the other hand the European interest. You have a problem, you have to deal with it, and most of the times you cannot deal with it on a national basis alone. You need to have at least part of the response is European, so you need to combine the two, and Europe is a way to enhance our interests and our power. And I don't believe actually anybody would stay in the EU if they didn't believe it was in their national interest. And one state did leave the EU because it didn't believe it was. And so they are trying to make the demonstration that they are better off outside, but I don't think anybody who's in at this point believes that.
Thanks a lot. And maybe to end on the more security and defense side of things before we move on to the discussion on the rule of law, I wanted to turn to Catherine. One of the questions in the chat, and I have to say it's an issue that we struggled also a bit with Susi when writing the paper, was that, we're quite struck with the confidence given to France on security and defense issues and the very low levels of trust, or I would say even maybe mistrust when it comes to handling relations with Russia and China. And so, what kind of hypothesis can we make of whether Europeans identify their interests, the security interests particularly? Do we see them? And I would say Russia and China, I guess Europeans see them also in a very different light when it comes to military conventional threats and a more economic threat. But do you think Europeans don't associate typically, well, I would say China with defense? I think it's clear now that we associate Russia with defense, but do you have a hypothesis on the gap between the two?
I think the gap between the two is that, to some extent, in terms of the trust in France's capacity to lead on defense or military. I mean, there are obvious reasons to this, right? There's the fact that at this point, France is the only nation in the EU with a nuclear deterrent. That obviously has to play a role. I think another issue is that France has never suggested that it would go at it alone. Everything that Macron has done from 2017 has been essentially to try and issue a wake-up call to other European EU powers, and in particular to Germany, who seems to now have taken an incredibly radical turn in terms of its own geopolitical role and actually its own political identity at the heart of the European Union. It's always been a call to move forward together, in a sense, in order to defend the interests of the European Union. Including, by taking what some considered to be rather extreme measures, which was, to call into question the capacity of NATO to actually be useful, at one particular point. Of course, the debate is being revisited now in light of events. But I think that, when it comes to China, the perception from most people is that, China, first of all, in most people imaginaries and in geographical terms is far away. I think that most Europeans have only gradually started to understand, that the dependency between the European Union in all sorts of ways. I think the pandemic refocused people's minds on this, but that the dependency that the European Union has vis-a-vis China is potentially, a security threat, security broadly defined, as we've been invoking throughout this session. But I also think that because not the threat from China, but to some extent, the instability and the challenges that may come from China are seen as linked to commercial interests. There is always a suspicion, I think, from our European partners and from other partners. I think more broadly, that when it comes down to it, in that kind of relationship, that France will try to seek something that it has traditionally done, which is to essentially serve its national champions and to serve its national interest more narrowly, if you like. Whether or not that's true is completely debatable at this point, because I think our dependencies with respect to China, if we think of component parts for solar panels, if we think of that kind of dependency, it's a European-wide issue. It's a very broad kind of challenge that we face. But still, I think there is from our European partners, a sense in which, from a defense perspective, we're all in this together and France can lead. But there is still a suspicion that France will try and kind of pull the covers toward it, and actually protect its own economy, its own national sovereignty, rather than European sovereignty when it comes to the relationship with China.
Thanks a lot. I have a flurry of questions coming in the chat, so I'm sorry. I'll actually ask David one last one on this particular topic before we actually move on to the rule of law. We have several questions, David, in the chat about Macron's special relationship with Putin, especially during this invasion. What can be gained for France from these discussions, especially for European security? And is there a sense that there is a risk to keep this communications line open?
No, I think my point earlier was to, maybe I'm wrong, but I get the feeling that our partners are actually quite happy that there is at least one line of communication that is working, even those who were unhappy with this line of communication before the conflict, because they were afraid that we were not going to play a European game in these discussions, wrongly. Now, I think in any conflict, you need to keep line of communications with the opposite party, and that's what we are doing. I'm not in those discussions, so I cannot say more than that. But I think it's generally seen as useful. Do you allow me, Tara, to make just a brief comment on the China-Russia issue that was just discussed? Because I think it's also important to point that we must. Vladimir Putin has invited himself at the top of our priorities, which, by the way, I think is one of his main objectives in this issue. But we shouldn't forget that there is also a China challenge that we have to deal with. And there are two different challenges. One is, I think, ultimately, one is the challenge of a declining power, and the other one is a challenge of a rising power. And I think you don't address them in the same way, but there is no doubt in our view that what's happening around China, the relationship with the Indo-Pacific should be high and probably higher in the EU strategy, in its ambitions, in its scope, and that's one of the things we've tried to contribute to in the framework of this presidency.
Thanks a lot. I will give Susi the floor 2 minutes because she had a two-finger on something that Catherine had said. And
yes, I promise to be quick because I know you're trying to move the conversation on, but just a very quick reaction to what David just said. I couldn't agree more that there is a very sort of strong sense in this data that, frustrating as it is for policymakers who are trying to ruthlessly prioritise, it would be very dangerous in terms of Europeans' perceptions of the European project delivering to sort of forget the last crisis, whether that is the kind of the economic challenge from China, challenge the international system from China, COVID, climate. There are very strong signals in there that that all that we're saying about the need to act more geopolitically on Russia also applies to the other threats that Europeans are worried about within this data set. And then just 2 words on what Catherine said about the sort of the French leadership concern about the sort of the style. This was something that Tara and I this was one of the reasons for going into this survey, that we shared that view. But actually, we came away from the survey data with a sense that this is something that policymakers worry about more than the public, because we put the same questions about whether or not people supported different policy initiatives at the European level to half of the sample saying that it was a French-led initiative and half the sample saying it was just a European initiative. And actually the kind of the French leadership dimension didn't seem to make a lot of difference, never more than a percentage point or so, in terms of support for the different European projects. So it seems that perhaps we in our kind of think tank community are sort of more worried about this than the general public are. So yeah, just a point of interest.
Thanks a lot, Susi. If we could turn to the slide on the rule.
It's not, sorry, it's not that I want to dodge the rule of law issue, but just one sentence. I think we should praise the wisdom of the respondents, because indeed French leadership can trigger doubts maybe with other officials, and for a very understandable reason is that our political system was designed quite differently from the EU's, completely around this notion of leadership. So it raises interest questions, but I think what matters is exactly what was just said, is that in a way it doesn't really matter if it's under French leadership or European leadership. What matters is that we move the ball forward, and I understand from the data that's what the respondents want. Sorry for interrupting.
No, sure. I'm hoping that at some point we'll get back to in-person meetings where we can truly interrupt one another and interject. So if we could get the slides up on the rule of law, because this is an issue where Europeans tend to trust France less than on other issues. And it is, I think it is quite important, especially with the issues that we're having both internally and externally. I think what's happening with the war in Ukraine poses this question again. Typically, we're seeing Putin trying to rewrite the international rule book. So how can we be ourselves actually, how we can lead by example? We had, let's say, disagreements with a number of EU member states, Poland and Hungary, namely, but then we also need, I would say, in the relationship with Russia and China, we also need to make sure that we lead by example. And so we're seeing quite a shift from some of these European Union member states that I mentioned. We're seeing Poland, take on a lot more Ukrainian refugees. Clément Beaune, the Minister for European Affairs, was at a public conference 2 days ago where he said that actually he was also very impressed by the organization in Poland of how these refugees are hosted right now. And so there is also a sense that this could change. But how do you think the French could be more vocal on this issue? I mean, I would say even more now than they've been in the past. Maybe this question to David first, and then I'll ask Susi and Catherine as well.
Thank you, Tara. If I read correctly the data, it's actually the issue on which the respondents trust us the most, unless I misread. Because you said
sorry. Yes, no, I was thinking about another slide that is in the paper. But let's talk about democracy and human rights for now. Let's go to that.
Yeah. So, I mean, actually, that's if you confirm, that's one of the, I think, interesting elements from this survey, that there is this level of trust in what we can do in this front. I'm comforted on that, because we do, and I hope it's been communicated strongly enough, but we do feel that the rule of law is not, the cherry on the cake of the French presidency. It's absolutely central in our agenda. Now there are, I would say, two issues there. One is towards the outside, and one is within the EU. Towards the outside, human rights, rule of law, it's integral to this crisis that we're having with Russia. In a way, it's all about it. So it's up to us to define, the toughest possible policy available for us to act in this struggle and support the Ukrainians. Now we have rule of law issues within the European Union. They've been with us for a while. Some of them are actually going through legal proceedings. Some of them are also a matter of, let's say, political debate within the Union. But in general, we have to be honest that the toolbox of the EU in this field was not so strong, just because we didn't really think that we would be at a point when we have such disagreements within the EU on rule of law issues. And I think it's important that these issues be dealt with in the way we do things in Europe, and so basically in a process that allows to put on the table objectively and even legally the difficulties, and then address them. This doesn't take anything away from the fact that we currently have an incredible wave of solidarity in the EU, and particularly in Poland, vis-à-vis the Ukrainian refugees. So to me, I hope that can create a new atmosphere. You see how everything is changing within the EU these days, how strongly we are insisting on unity, because unity as such is a way to be powerful, and to send also signals to Putin, and hopefully to make him recalculate a little bit. And so I hope this can also create a new atmosphere between member states when we have some sticky issues. But as I said, in this crisis, we must learn to become harder, to have more tools to act outside of the EU against anything that threatens us. But we must keep the promise of the European project. And what makes it so specific is that it's both a legal and a political project. So the rule of law, in my view, is more than ever the cornerstone of the whole project.
Thanks a lot. Catherine, I'll turn to you. What do you think France could do more on when it comes to rule of law? Because we're seeing that it's going, as I said, as David mentioned as well, it's both an internal and external issue. It's typically one of these examples of European power that you can't really distinguish between internal affairs and foreign affairs. And so what could we do more of if we are still to lead diplomatically on this? Sorry, you're muted again.
I think there's at least a couple of issues here. One is that I think that one of the things that France needs to do, and probably up its game on, is to actually, when it comes to the process of accession for a number of these countries, is to be absolutely crystal clear and not to come across as quite so unpredictable in its judgments. I think that there is no question that all of a sudden, because of the because of the current situation, that we should, get rid of all the rules, and accelerate, the process of accession, far too fast. And, it is, as David was saying, this is a legal commitment. It's also a political commitment, and therefore rule of law and acceptance of these norms is something that is absolutely at the heart of it. But I think that, whether it comes to Ukraine or to the other countries that have, registered their interest in accession, it's important to do two things. It's important to really be serious about the process, have a predictable process, make sure that when the boxes are ticked, the boxes really are ticked. And we cannot afford, in other words, to treat these countries in the way that, to some extent, that we treated Turkey, in the past. It has to be far clearer, and whatever deals we strike with them, have to be deals that don't actually compromise our capacity to be clear-eyed about whether or not they have fulfilled, their commitments in terms of being accession countries. And I think that when it comes to, so I think that and France has notoriously been seen as as volatile, and Macron has come down quite harshly on a number of the processes that had begun, and potentially with good reason. However, if there's a process, that process needs to be stuck to, and the promise needs to be real. But then I think there's also the challenges that we face right now, and it's very, very important. For example, with respect to Hungary or with respect to Poland, and particularly with respect to Poland, that's asked for essentially a special treatment, because of the number of refugees that it's accepting. I think that this is naked opportunism on the part of the Poles. They are fulfilling their commitments as part of a community of nations. I think if there's something that can be done in terms of extra funds, the relabeling of some of the recovery funds, particularly to address the crisis that it's facing now, then by all means this should be done. But the idea that the rules should be loosened precisely at a time when we face a conflict that is about norms, that is about territorial sovereignty, that is about human rights, that is about the protection of civilians, this is absolutely impossible.
Thanks a lot. And by saying just what you just said, you also addressed one of the questions in the chat. So that's great. Thanks a lot. Maybe actually and we have only 5 minutes left, so I'll try and be quick, and I'll ask my panelists to be so too. David, a question for you precisely about the accession issue that Catherine mentioned. We're seeing now a prospect for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia to potentially get into the EU at some point. What do you think symbolically this means as well, and to do so in the middle of the war? I guess there is also an idea for the EU to remain a power of norms, or a normative power. But how will we deal with this later on? I mean, France was also knowingly one of the European Union member states who was in the enlargement versus deepening debate, more in the side of deepening the EU, moving towards an ever closer union. So how has Paris changed on that? Because we also know that there's now a conference on the Western Balkans that's part of the French Council of the EU Presidency priorities that's going to take place in June. So we're seeing a shift from the French side. What do you think we can make of it?
Thank you. I was quite happy with the previous comments on this issue, but since you asked me directly, I'll make a few comments. One is, of course, it's a very powerful, symbolic, political move that the Council unanimously asked the Commission the advice on the request by Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I think we're at a time when symbolism matters a great deal. That's one thing. The other thing, you're quite right. We were and we still are reluctant to think about enlargement without deepening. I would argue that just now, as we speak, we are deepening to a very great deal. the European Union. So this can also inform the way we look at enlargement. Then enlargement follows a process. We won't go into that. We are unhappy with this process. It has been revisited a little bit, and now this will start to unfold with those three countries, as it was already doing with a number of other countries. I still think, and this will be debated, I'm sure, tonight, I still think we need to think also a little bit outside of the box in what we do, both before any accession, but also after. So before any accession, we will not remain in the next months and years in the we cannot remain in the same pattern that we have had with these countries, because of the magnitude of what is happening on the ground. Our relationship with Ukraine is already transformed by what has happened in the last 2 weeks. So in one way or another, it will have to reflect in the type of relationship that we develop, not in 10 or 20 years, but immediately. But then we also need to think of the day these accessions happen. I'm talking also about countries in the Balkans and so on, about how we will work, because frankly at 27 it's already not always easy. So if we are 33 or more, it will not either. So we have, I think, a little bit of time for that, but we need to work on it. And that's where what we are witnessing now, what we are living, is such a pivotal moment for the European Union as well.
Thanks a lot. I'll turn back to the three of you with one last question, and it's a big one, so you can answer very shortly. What do you think our data means for French leadership and influence in the months to come? Because I think we're looking, as David said, as right now a dramatic deepening of the EU. So what can we expect? Maybe David, we'll start with you. We'll go to Catherine and then Susi.
As much as I like the idea that we would be recognized as the leaders of Europe, in fact, it's not really how it works. I think it's the IDs can lead. So maybe a number of French IDs have now found a number of supporters. But I think in the EU, it's really collective leadership. And in fact, when you see, I have a hard time saying who has led in the momentous decisions that we have taken in the last 2 weeks, because it's really collective. It's the institutions, it's the member states, and we certainly have played our role as France and as presidency. But to me, the future of Europe is being united, work France and Germany and the other partners, because we know now more than ever, you don't get far if you don't have a Franco-German agreement. But if you have a Franco-German agreement, it's not enough, and you need also to get the other players on board, and that's what we will try to do under our presidency and after.
Thanks a lot, Catherine.
So I think, that to some extent, Macron has been paving the way very effectively for this. I think the French presidency has risen to the challenge. I also think, though, that there's an election campaign going on. And so, to some extent, what will happen is what needs to happen, which is that to some extent, I would expect probably Germany to start taking a lead and Scholz to start taking a lead as Macron is otherwise engaged. But I think that that's exactly right. I think if anything, your survey shows that one of the things that is at the heart of this European Union is right now a very strong relationship and a trusting relationship between France and Germany. And I think that to some extent we're going to see this continue to yield results. And I think David is right that it's the kind of the coordination and the broadening and the alliance building that is key to moving forward. But we also know that France is going to be committed to this.
Thanks a lot, Susi. You have the final word.
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, I very much agree with what the other panelists have said, but I think I would sort of come back to where I started, which is that I really see that this situation has sort of transformed the meaning of the European project, or at least intensified the meaning of the European project for European citizens. So it seems to me that the leadership challenge going forward for the second half of the French presidency after the elections, but then presidencies beyond that is turning the crisis response into a permanent state of being for European leadership and European power, and creating building on the momentum that has been sort of started through fear, and transforming that into our practical way of working, the ability to bring together the different elements of what constitute European power, and so that would be my wish for the opportunity that is before us if we end up with a new French president with a pro-European agenda and a very pro-European German government. I think there is a chance to really sort of drive that forward.
Thanks a lot to the three of you, David, Catherine, and Susi. For everyone who listened in and sent your questions, I'm sorry we didn't manage to get to all of them. Please read our paper. It's available online in French and English. For now, I will wish you all a very good afternoon if you are in Europe, and evening if you're in Asia. Have a great day. Merci encore beaucoup. À bientôt.